Thank you so much. It's a very great honor to be receiving this prize. I'm very humbled by it and I'm extremely excited to be here. Thank you very much to the symposium speakers. I've had a wonderful afternoon of really exciting talks and I hope you guys have enjoyed them as well. I think that my talk today is going to pull together quite a lot of the threads that we've been hearing about in this session and hopefully, the introduction that some of you have had if you're in this session will help to follow the flow. But I'll just also try to cover the things in case the people weren't here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about semantic control and the idea that it's a distinct, flexible system for regulating meaning. And we saw lots of talks earlier which had this picture in it, showing that our conceptual knowledge is formed from many different features which need to be integrated to form heteromodal concepts. And it's a very rich store of knowledge. We have many different kinds of knowledge about any given concept and lots of different associations. And so a key idea is that this store of knowledge might not be sufficient for successful semantic cognition because you also have to focus your retrieval on the aspects of knowledge that matter for a given task or the particular context that you find yourself in. And sometimes it might not be that necessary to focus semantic cognition on relevant information because some aspects of our knowledge are already stored in the system in a very dominant way. So for example, if you encounter the concept dog and the concept lead, you might be able to recover the fact that this concept is linked to the idea of taking a dog for a walk relatively easily because, of course, that's something that you might see every day or you might do every day. But if I gave you a different context like cinema, it's more difficult to think how dog could relate to cinema, and there's lots of different kinds of associations that you could rather creatively generate. So you could think about, for example, doggy cinema, which I think is a concept. Or you could think about a particular film which contains dogs. But you would have to select one of these possible associations, and you'd need to selectively focus retrieval on those features which elaborated that particular association in order to come up with a link like the homomorphic Dalmatians. So this talk will be considering the brain mechanisms and the cognitive mechanisms that allow us to focus our semantic retrieval in this way. So I got interested in the varieties of semantic impairment, the idea that there might be different component processes that contribute to semantic cognition through the comparison of different patient groups who have semantic problems. And quite a lot of the talks today already discuss the differences between semantic dementia and semantic aphasia. So I heard from Hannah and Becky, for example, this comparison. So Matt and I got interested in the idea that these patient groups might have difficulty on the same semantic tasks, but perhaps for different reasons. So both patients with semantic dementia and patients with semantic aphasia have problems retrieving knowledge from different modalities. They have equal problems with word and picture semantic tasks, for example. But they might fail these tasks for different reasons. And for those of you who saw Matt's talk earlier in the symposium, you'll know that the anterior temporal lobes shows progressive degeneration in patients with semantic dementia who have a variant of frontotemporal dementia, which seems to cause a loss of conceptual knowledge that gradually progresses from more specific distinctions to more general aspects of knowledge. We wanted to know whether patients with semantic aphasia who fail the same range of tasks would show a different pattern. And so we started to compare these groups, and we found that there were a range of differences which seemed important. So patients with semantic dementia were already known to be very sensitive to word frequency. They're able to retrieve or understand the meanings of words that are high frequency for longer in the condition than words that are low frequency, and that's because high frequency concepts are more strongly represented in the semantic system and they're more robust in the face of the progressive neurodegeneration. Whereas patients with semantic aphasia prove to be relatively insensitive to frequency and actually sometimes showing reverse frequency effects. Hannah talked about how patients with semantic dementia are highly consistent. And Matt pointed out that there are lots of different modalities that you can test semantics in. And these patients with semantic dementia are highly consistent across all these modalities. So if a patient doesn't know what a screwdriver is, for example, from the word, that single patient will also have difficulty recovering that conceptual knowledge from a picture as well. And that's consistent with the idea that the concepts themselves are degrading in semantic dementia. But in contrast, patients with semantic aphasia seem much more sensitive to the task demands and therefore less consistent when you compare tasks that are different. And Hannah also talked about how patients make different kinds of errors in picture naming tasks. And patients with semantic dementia typically produce subordinate responses, like they might tell you that this is an animal. They might also be able to tell you it's not a dog, so it's not a high-frequency animal that they still know. But they would very rarely make responses like this that you see in semantic aphasia. So patients with semantic aphasia might call this animal a rhinoceros. Or they might produce a response like zoo, which is thematically linked to the target, but not a relevant name to retrieve for this concept. And so the kinds of errors you see in semantic aphasia imply that these patients have knowledge that's still retained in the semantic system, but they're unable to recover it at the moment that they need it. And Hannah also talked about how picture naming cues are very helpful for retrieving more information in patients with semantic aphasia. So in this experiment, we did progressive phonological cue, and the patients with semantic aphasia in orange are able to recover nearly all of these picture names if they're given enough of a cue, suggesting that the information is still there in the system, but they were unable to retrieve it when they weren't cued. In contrast, patients with semantic dementia in blue, they improve a bit, but clearly, but nowhere near as much. So there's evidence here that semantic aphasia patients retain knowledge, but they fail to retrieve it appropriately. So one thing that we got very interested in quite early on was the question of whether there's a distributed network that's important for semantic control. And a lot of people initially were very comfortable with us telling them that the prefrontal cortex might be important for semantic control because these patients typically have damage to the left inferior frontal gyrus in the prefrontal cortex. But we also could see that quite a lot of these patients had posterior temporal lobe damage. And we wondered whether this was because there might be a distributed network that's a large-scale network important for semantic control, which might include elements that are outside the prefrontal cortex. But the problem is that these lesions are very large and they're very variable. So it can be quite difficult to tell which regions are important for the function. So this was work that was led by Hannah Thompson, who spoke earlier. And Hannah took all the patients' data that we had and divided it into whether the patients had prefrontal injury or whether they didn't have prefrontal injury. And although the majority of patients do have damage to the left inferior frontal gyrus, there are these posterior patients who don't. So the question is, do these patients still have problems with semantic control tasks? And Hannah actually already helped us to understand both of these tasks. So the reason that we compare these tasks is because they both involve semantic control of a similar type, but one of these tasks is verbal and the other is non-verbal. So patients are asked to understand the meaning of an ambiguous word, but one of the interpretations is dominant, so it's much easier to access, and the other interpretation is a subordinate meaning. And then we have a non-verbal task where patients see a picture of a task context like a fly on the food, which you want to get rid of, and you've got some pictures of objects you could use to accomplish that goal. And in the easy condition, the canonical object is present as a fly swat that you can choose, but in the harder condition, the fly swat is missing, and you have to choose an object that has the right sensory motor features to accomplish the goal. So you have to use an object in a non-canonical way, such as the roll-up newspaper. And the important point here is you can see that the patients with prefrontal injuries and those with posterior temporal injuries both show a strong difference. So they're paired up the subordinate or non-canonical patterns of retrieval far more than they are impaired of the dominant or canonical patterns of retrieval. So it's evidence for a distributed network in which there are both frontal and posterior temporal components, which might be important for heteromodal semantic control. And over many studies, Matt and I and other colleagues started to build a picture of a distributed semantic control network in which we could see evidence across different neuroscientific methods. So Becky Jackson talked about fMRI meta-analyses, probably other people have done too. So if you have a range of different semantic tasks that involve controls, such as looking at ambiguous words or subordinate meanings over dominant meanings, or situations where there are lots of competitors to a concept you're trying to retrieve compared with few competitors, or there are weak associations, there are strong associations. All these very diverse manipulations of semantic control all activate this network of brain regions important for semantic control. And we also find that TNS, as Sandra was talking about earlier, applied to both the left and prefrontal gyrus and the posterior middle temporal gyrus, disrupted people's ability to access the weak associations efficiently, but had no impact on their efficient retrieval of the strong associations, consistent with the idea that both of these areas are playing an important role in semantic control. So if semantic control is an entity, we might expect it to have a distinctive pattern of connectivity so that it can act as a functional network. And in this study, what we found was that that the semantic control network has connectivity to both the key region for long-term semantic representation in the anterior temporal lobes, but also strong connectivity to areas important for executive control. So that's also in the inferior frontal sulcus. So we've got two methods here. We have resting state fMRI, where we're just looking at time series correlations between brain regions as a function of their functional connectivity. And we've also got structural connectivities of tract geography here. And the pattern is that if you seed the executive region and the anterior temporal lobes and recover their patterns of functional and structural connectivity and then overlap them, what you find is that they overlap in the semantic control network. And the semantic control network is the only area in the brain where you see structural and functional connectivity to both the anterior temporal lobes and the control network. Consistent with the idea that this semantic control network might be drawing together semantic representations with control processes, which often are considered to be actually anti-correlated. So when executive regions are engaged, very often areas like the anterior temporal lobes are more deactivated. But of course, we need to be able to engage both the executive system and semantic representations together to accomplish semantic control. And so this gives rise to the hypothesis that Rocco actually talked about a minute ago for people who are in this session, that the semantic control network might be juxtaposed between areas of the multiple demand network, which is important for executive control, and areas of the default mode network. So classically, the default mode network is defined as those areas that deactivate when people do more demanding tasks. And this version of the default mode network that we use in our analysis is from a resting state parcellation. So taking resting state, dividing it up into patterns of connectivity which occur where the regions are co-fluctuating through time. And so these areas are associated with internal cognition, aspects of memory, and very often things like mind wandering, which are thought to be maybe less controlled states. In contrast, the multiple demand network, defined here by John Duncan and colleagues, is a conjunction of difficulty across many different kinds of tasks. So if you take hard tasks over easy tasks, and you work out a conjunction of all the different kinds of cognition, all the different kinds of tasks, and look at what's commonly activated, you see these blue regions. And the semantic control network, you can kind of see from this slide, is partially overlapping with both of these networks and sits in between them on the cortical surface in multiple areas. So this leads to a bit of a challenge, or potential challenge, for our interpretation of the deficits in semantic aphasia. So if the executive network and the semantic control network are adjacent on the cortical surface, stroke is perhaps quite likely to damage both networks simultaneously. And Matt and I knew right from the beginning, in fact, that one of the key differences between semantic dementia and semantic aphasia is that patients with semantic dementia are generally quite good at domain general executive tasks, at least in the early stages of the disease, when their semantic deficits are already quite pronounced, and perhaps before the atrophy starts to spread in the context of frontotemporal dementia to frontal lobe regions. In contrast, we knew that our semantic aphasia group were more variable and, in general, a bit impaired at executive tasks. In this example from Nick Suter, we're looking at the Brixton test, where you have to anticipate where a dot will move over time. You have to choose the location you think the dot will go to, and the dot follows certain sequences backwards and forwards, and then the sequence will change, so it'll start moving in a different way. And you have to anticipate where it will move and then flexibly adjust your predictions when the pattern changes. And we found that our patients with semantic dementia were impaired at this task, and their impairments were correlated quite strongly with their semantic difficulties. So we've got two hypotheses now. One is that the semantic control network is a distinct entity, which is damaging patients with semantic aphasia, and that's giving rise to problems with semantic control. And another hypothesis is that it's a damage to multiple demand network that these patients have, which is having an impact on their semantic performance. But in this study led by Nick Suter, what we thought was that although these networks are adjacent in the left hemisphere, they're also rather different in the right hemisphere. So the semantic control network is very strongly left lateralized, whereas the multiple demand network is bilateral. And as a consequence, we might expect different patterns of disconnection in the brain to predict problems with semantic tasks and non-semantic executive tasks in patients with semantic dementia. So bilateral disconnection might be important for domain general executive control, whereas disconnection in the left hemisphere should be more important for semantic tasks. And that's essentially the pattern that we found. So this first panel is showing lesion symptom mapping. So looking at where in the brain a patient having a lesion predicts poor performance for semantic tasks on the left-hand side and domain general executive tasks on the right. And you can see that there's a pattern of regions in the left prefrontal, left parietal, and left posterior and temporal cortex, just broadly consistent with the patterns for the semantic control network that we argued for. An executive impairment is associated with partially overlapping, but yet spatially distinct damage to more posterior frontal regions and parietal regions. But the disconnection was more dramatic and different. So in particular, executive control tasks are involved and reveal a disconnection. They're correlated with disconnection between the two hemispheres across the corpus callosum. So in this analysis, we're essentially simulating the pattern of disconnection you'd expect from the patient's lesions. And the simulation suggests that connection between the two hemispheres is critical for domain general and executive tasks, while connection within the left hemisphere, semantic control network, is important for semantic control. So far I have presented two patterns of dissociation. We've got three networks which are potentially important or relevant for semantic cognition. And I've shown you that there's a dissociation between semantic control and semantic aphasia and long-term semantic representation or semantic memory in semantic dementia. But also that semantic control and domain general executive control can be dissociated in terms of patterns of disconnection. So that left lateralized connectivity might be more important for semantic control, while bilateral connections might be more important for executive control. So now we want to think about neuroimaging evidence, which is consistent with this story. And I'm going to tell you about two studies, the first of which will look at a retrieval of more dominant aspects of memory versus more unusual aspects of memory, so perhaps linking to what Hannah presented earlier on creativity. And the second study looking at the neural code for difficulty and consistent with something that Rocco presented. So Rocco already mentioned that we know something very important about the default mode network's position in the brain. It's at the location on the cortical surface, which is a maximum distance from sensory motor regions. And as a consequence, as Rocco noted, it might have important consequences for the function of the default mode network. And thinking about what the function, thinking about what the consequences are in semantic cognition, I'm just going to borrow from this diagram we've seen before that was originally used to describe the functions of the anterior temporally in the paper by Matt. But I'm going to sort of use it for a slightly different function here to think about when we might expect the default mode network, responses within the default mode network, to be sufficient for certain aspects of semantic retrieval and when it might not be sufficient. So given that the default mode network is situated in this special location far away from and equidistant between many different sensory motor inputs, we can think of this white area as being a little bit like the default mode network in the sense that it's situated between different inputs and it's, as a consequence, it's potentially constrained by many different features. And this convergence from many different features makes it, in some ways, like an attractor base. So in situations where you've got multiple inputs, that might help to constrain what you're going to retrieve. You might expect the default mode network to be interested in those situations and perhaps not to require so much semantic control to do the relevant pattern of retrieval. So I'm going to talk about a study that was led by Katia Krieger-Redwood, which in some ways provides some evidence in favor of this idea. So Katia was interested in situations where people had to generate a link between two words. And if the default mode network is kind of like an attractor basin, the default mode network might be sufficient to recover links when you're given two words which are already highly associated, because those words will make you very consistently think about the same thing. Those words might have been associated together many times. And in many different kinds of contexts, these concepts can still be linked. In contrast, if you're given two words like dog and cinema, which are not normally connected, might require more constraint on this pattern of retrieval to come up with a link and then to deploy it in the task to perhaps generate a more flexible or creative response. Okay, so what we did was presented word pairs that varied in their associative strength. So there are word pairs like dog and lead, which is strongly associated and typically make people say the word walk. And then there's the pair dog and cinema, which are more weakly associated, and people should produce more varying responses as a consequence of the weak association. But they might say 101 Dalmatians. And what the slide's first showing you is the activation in the brain when you look at the parametric effect of strength of association. So we've got lots of different trials. They vary in associative strength, all the way from extremely associated to completely not linked at all. And people can still produce some response to unconnected words. And the areas in blue, including the posterior cingulate cortex in the default mode network, but also sensory motor bridges, are more active when the words that people are linking are more strongly associated. While regions of the semantic control network, including left prefrontal gyrus, the sort of dorsal medial prefrontal cortex that Sandra talked about, and this posterior temporal cortex, these regions are all active when people, or more active when people are retrieving weaker associations. Katia also asked people how they were generating the link, and for strong associations, they tended to report more often that they were using episodic memory. So you can imagine how this might work. If I have recently taken the dog for a walk, then the dog walk lead combination is more available to me. And of course, strong associations will occur more often in the environment. And so I might be able to come up with an episodic memory more often for those kinds of things. And it also means that our two memory systems, semantic and episodic memory, at that time are pushing us convergently in the same direction, helping us to think about that link so that we can rely on the kind of coherence between them to come up with an association. And what we find is that when people are using episodic memory, there's more activation within the network of regions which already gave us more response when the association was strong. So default mode regions, including posterior cingulate cortex and angular gyrus, for example, respond to episodic memory. We also looked at the uniqueness of the response, and Hannah talked about analyses which do the same kind of thing. So participants come out with all kinds of crazy stuff, but sometimes it's more crazy than other times. And you can code how semantically similar is each response to all the other participants in the experiment. And this is our measure of uniqueness here. And when participants produced a more unique response, they were generating more activation within the semantic control network, again within the area that was associated with retrieving associations to weak concepts. And so we have a dissociation here between the semantic control network and the default mode network in terms of the kinds of patterns of retrieval that these networks are supporting. One way of thinking about this is that when semantic memory and episodic memory, for example, are coherent, it constrains very strongly what you can retrieve. It might make your retrieval super efficient. It might push you into a part of space where it's kind of highly aligned with all the things that you've extracted over many experiences and across many features. But when you want to do something different, so for example, you have to think about 101 Dalmatians following dog and cinema, you need to make your system do something else. And so perhaps one way you could do this would be by selectively representing in the semantic control system the features from a particular sensory modality which is linked to the association you're forming. So, for example, I might visualize the cartoon dogs. So I might generate semantic activation that's more linked to the visual system. And this would then bias my subsequent retrieval so that it was more consistent with this particular association rather than other irrelevant associations or other associations I could have formed. And if this kind of account is correct, then we would expect the neural code in this semantic control network to essentially be semantic and consequently very different from the neural code that normally captures the difficulty of a task in general. So they might support executive control across the multiple demand network. And so the next experiment I want to tell you about was testing this idea. So this was work that was led by Jiao, and Jiao compared two verbal tasks that vary in difficulty in different ways. We have another experiment using strength association. So it's very similar to the last one. We've got many word pairs. People have to judge if the words are related or not. And they vary parametrically from strongly associated to weakly associated. So that's a manipulation of difficulty in the semantic domain. And then we also looked at working memory load, which is a verbal task, but involves a non-semantic manipulation of difficulty. And in terms of the activation in our functional networks that I've been describing, what we see is that both verbal semantic associations and verbal working memory activate what's currently colored here as green. So they're parts of the semantic control network that are overlapping with the multiple demand network. So these are multiple demand regions, but they're also linked to difficult verbal tasks, especially in the semantic domain by Becky's meta-analysis. But what's different is that in the semantic task, you also get maximum activation in regions of the semantic control network which lie outside multiple demand. And then we used multivariate pattern analysis to look at how we could decode difficulty in these different networks. And what we find is that semantic difficulty can actually be decoded by all of the networks. And I don't know if we'll have time to get into it in questions or later. I want to be clear that I'm not trying to argue that the default mode network doesn't support control or that it doesn't do anything that's relevant to difficult semantic judgments, because that's not actually what I believe. All of these networks can decode semantic difficulty, but the key difference is that the multiple demand network can decode difficulty outside the semantic domain. So in this right-hand bar, we're looking at cross-classification. We train the classifier on the difficulty of a semantic judgment, and we test it on the difficulty of working memory, or vice versa. And you can cross-classify difficulty in the multiple demand network, and you can't cross-classify difficulty in the semantic network, which shows us that the semantic control network is a different neural code to capture the difficulty of a semantic decision. Okay, so I've shown you some evidence for a dissociation between these functional networks across both neuropsychology and neuroimaging. And I just want to sort of pick up on some of the things that Rocco was talking about in his talk. So these networks are not randomly arranged on the cortical surface. They're organized systematically, as Rocco very nicely showed. And as a consequence, it's possible to look at how the response changes within these networks systematically. So in this study that was led by Shui Wang, we looked at participants performing a feature matching task, where they have to match the words like color and raspberry, based on the color of the concept. And what we manipulated was orthogonal to the task, so not part of what they had to do, but we also manipulated the global semantic similarity between the words being matched. So sweet corn and buttercup share some semantic features. They share a color, but they're also both plants, so that makes them quite similar. But then on the other hand, buttercups are poisonous flowers and sweet corn is a delicious vegetable, so they're also not so similar. And then tomato and postbox really only share their color, and they're not semantically similar apart from color. What we looked at is how a parametric manipulation of global semantic similarity modulated activation within the different functional networks. And what we find is areas of the default mode network show more activation when concepts share more features, while areas towards the multiple demand network show more activation when concepts share fewer features. In semantic control network shows an intermediate response. Now, I don't think the default mode network's response is just to do with difficulty, although it's easier to say the strawberry and raspberry are more similar. That they share a color because they're more similar, that makes it easier. But we also looked at trials like strawberry and banana, where you have to respond, no, they don't share a color. And the default mode network still shows more activation for those semantically similar pairs. Well, of course, the multiple demand network is very sensitive to the difficulty of the decision. And as Rocco said, the semantic control network shows elements of both of those aspects. And that means that it has an intermediate response in this sort of gradient. Rocco introduced the idea of large-scale connectivity patterns. And we've also used this approach in this study here. So Rocco showed you an image a little bit like this one. This is the principal gradient intrinsic connectivity. So it's looking at resting state fMRI, and in a holistic way, what the connectivity similarity is like between different brain regions. So the way to interpret this is the red areas show similar patterns of connectivity to each other along this dimension, and very different patterns of connectivity to the blue areas, but the blue areas have more similarity to each other. So if you use this approach, the principal gradient captures the aspect of resting state connectivity that explains the most variance, and essentially corresponds to something a little bit like a cortical hierarchy that goes from transmodal to unimodal cortex. We know that this pattern of intrinsic connectivity correlates with distance from the sensory-motor cortex, and that makes sense because the thing that more strongly than anything determines intrinsic connectivity patterns is spatial adjacency. So two areas that are close to each other on the cortical surface will typically have similar patterns of connectivity. So now we can also take our functional networks and ask how they sit within this cortical hierarchy or dimension of cortical function. And we find that, again, the semantic control network, at least the areas that are within the multiple demand network, are kind of in between other control areas and default mode areas. Okay, so this is the last study that I want to tell you about. And I wanted to show you this study because it helps me to explain that although the semantic control network has a distinctive function for semantic cognition, its role isn't fixed. Of course, brain networks actually change their patterns of connectivity over time. And this is very important to how the whole brain really supports cognition. So we can look at these large-scale patterns of connectivity in tasks as well as during rest. And in this study, again by Jia Gao, he looks at a parametric manipulation strength of association, very similar to all of the experiments I've talked about. And this time he looks at how similar is the brain's activation pattern within different triads. So for example, is there a similar pattern of activity in a certain brain region for tulip bars and for fire forest? And then you can also compute another similarity between fire and forest and mirror and lantern. So for each pair of trials in the experiment, you can say how similar is the brain's response to this particular semantic decision. And then you can look at, this gives you essentially a connectivity matrix. You can look at how that similarity changes over the cortical surface. And you get something very similar to the principal gradient. So it basically stretches from transmodal regions in warm colors to unimodal regions in cooler colors. So by taking this approach, we're able to ask questions about how the whole landscape of the connectivity of the cortex is changing in a task, rather than just looking at individual regions and how they might change their response. And so we can now apply an analysis where we can take a sliding window. We can ask, okay, how similar are trials when we just look at the strongly associated items? How similar are the trials when we look at items that have a middle level of association strength, and how similar are trials when we look at the least associated items? And in that way, you can build up a picture of how each brain region is changing its pattern of connectivity based on strength and association. And the red areas here are areas which become more transmodal in their response when you're processing stronger associations. To make the pattern more digestible, I can show you what we find within our functional networks that I've been talking about. What you find is that it's the yellow and green bars. So these are the areas of the semantic control network which change their response the most. So the semantic control network has a very flexible pattern of connectivity. It's essentially able to couple to different parts of the rest of the brain, depending on the task demands. And one way of thinking about this is that the semantic control network, when you're presented with strong associations and you don't require a lot of semantic control, the semantic control network becomes more similar in the information that it's maintaining and in its informational connectivity to other default mode regions. It essentially becomes part of the default mode network. While the semantic control network then separates from those regions and becomes more functionally similar to visual motor and other attention regions when you have to employ semantic control to make a decision. And that might be because in these situations where you're trying to come up with a link between mirror and lantern, you can do that by focusing on a specific kind of feature and using additional input from this feature to drive the activation through the semantic system in a different way that generates this particular association. So here are my take-home messages for you. Semantic aphasia. Patients with semantic aphasia who have left hemisphere stroke have difficulty regulating semantic retrieval. They have a quality different pattern of semantic impairment from semantic dimension. And we've also found dissociable patterns of disconnection might underpin executive problems in this group versus executive control problems on non-semantic tasks. We have evidence that semantic control network falls spatially in between the default mode network and the multiple demand network. So that's the sort of topographic analysis that Rocco was talking about. And we also see that this network has an intermediate response in terms of the effect of task demands and in patterns of connectivity. And finally, we see that semantic control within the semantic control network is defined by these dynamic shifts in network configuration, which I think are very important for understanding context-sensitive retrieval. I'd like to finish by thanking all of my collaborators. I started trying to assemble a slide with everybody's name, and I realized that, of course, this is a ridiculous thing to do. It's important for me to acknowledge that all of the work that I've talked about is a team effort, and the teams I've worked on have had a tremendous impact on my thought processes and on the work that we've done. Some of the team members are in the room. The people who aren't know who they are, and I'm really, really grateful to every single one of my collaborators for making my life really enjoyable and making our science fun. I'd also like to thank the ERC who funded most of the work that I presented today. And a quick, advert for ICON, which is an international conference on memory that's coming up in Glasgow that I'm helping to organise. Thank you very much.